This is episode 127 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Tiffany Stern of the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Whenever the new monarch, there was a very, very elaborate procession through the City of London from the Tower of London through to the Strand in the west. Whifflers were used then in large numbers just to kind of guard the way and clear the roads and so on.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The Oxford English Dictionary defines a whiffler as, quote, one of a body of attendants armed with a javelin, battle axe, sword, or staff, employed to keep the way clear for a procession or at some public spectacle, end quote. For the life of William Shakespeare, these whifflers were widely used in a variety of places, including at public performances of drama, and would have been a well-known part of London life for William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare writes about whifflers only once in his works, and that comes to us in the chorus of Henry V, when the chorus says, quote, behold, the English beach pales in the flood with men, with wives and boys, whose shouts and claps outvoice the deep-mouthed sea, which like a mighty whiffler for the king seems to prepare his way, end quote. Shakespeare's reference backs up the OED's definition for whiffler as someone with a reputation for clearing a path. While they are not spoken of as often as actors or musicians, whifflers were an essential part of a very unique spectacle from Shakespeare's lifetime, that of the civic pageant. A lot like a street fair today, or perhaps more like a vaudeville act, this form of drama that included the work of whifflers alongside actors, dancers, and musicians took place in the street, where clearing paths would have been essential to both the performance as well as ensuring general traffic was not obstructed due to the spectacle. Whifflers and their civic pageantry produced a kind of entertainment that for 16th century London was a foundational part of England's national identity. Here to help us explore exactly what a whiffler was, how they worked, and precisely why they needed a javelin or a battle axe is our guest and expert on whifflers in early modern London, Tracey Hill. Tracey Hill is professor of early modern literature and culture at Bath Spa University in the UK. She specializes in the cultural history of the early modern city of London and is the author of 2 books, Anthony Munday and Civic Culture, and Pageantry and Power, a cultural history of the early modern Lord Mayor's Show, as well as a number of book chapters and journal articles. She is editor-in-chief of the Records of Early English Drama Project Civic London, 1558 to 1642, and a Freeman of the City of London and of the Founders Company. Hello, Tracey. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for having me.
There's only one reference to whiffler that I was able to find in Shakespeare's plays, and it comes from Henry V, where they're describing a whiffler as being comparable to the roaring ocean. Shakespeare uses the phrase, a mighty whiffler that prepares the way for the king. This reference comes from the chorus in Act 5 of Shakespeare's Henry V. Tracey, Shakespeare's reference to whifflers in Henry V makes them sound quite formidable. Were whifflers pretty imposing physically?
No, not really. The reality is actually much more kind of prosaic and quotidian than that. But actually, I want to kind of come back to the way that they're presented in Henry V later on, because like a mighty whiffler, I think is a really interesting kind of simile to use. So the whiffler, it's not a real whiffler he's got in mind here. It's what whiffler represents.
So it's almost a joke.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. So going back to the question, no, not necessarily. I mean, as I'll expand more later on, they're just ordinary people.
Well, to explore where they were used, I know that in addition to the Lord Mayor's show every October, there were other kinds of civic pageants and performances that would have employed a Whiffler. So tell us about where they would have appeared.
Oh, quite regularly, actually. Obviously, the Lord Mayor's Day was every late October, as you say, and Whifflers were used by every single livery company, and there were 80 of them for that event. But there were also other events which happened less regularly. Whenever the new monarch, there was a very, very elaborate procession through the City of London from the Tower of London through to the Strand in the west. Whifflers were used then in large numbers just to kind of guard the way and clear the roads and so on. They were also used on other kind of royal occasions, such as when a new Prince of Wales was being installed. So that was 1610 for Prince Henry, who then, of course, died a couple of years later. And then 1616, his son, his brother, rather younger brother, Charles, was installed. And there was pageantry in the city for that. When you had members of the royal family coming to visit the city, the same thing applied. The companies came out in force and in lavish kind of costumes and so on. And Whifflers were used for events such as the visit of Marie de Medici, who was King Charles I's mother-in-law in 1638. So people living in London, basically, in short, would have seen Whifflers performing their functions on a number of occasions, definitely for the show, but elsewhere as well.
Both the OED and Shakespeare's reference in Henry V connect Whifflers with serving the royal household specifically. Were they typically employed in royal households? A lot of those events were royal, sort of instituted by the monarch type events, but were they used other places too?
No, they weren't really. I mean, the royal household may have had individuals who performed the same function, but the Whifflers within civic pageantry were actually employed by the city. So they were employed by, they were actually members of, in most cases, the livery companies of London. Even though the events I've just described were there to commemorate or honour or acknowledge somebody from the monarchy, it didn't follow that they were part of the monarchical household.
Did a Whiffler have a certain uniform that would identify them in these crowds as being a Whiffler?
Yeah, I've got an image which is a bit later, but I can share it with you if you give me a second. Right, there he is.
Yay! Oh, wow, that's so cool.
This is from a text that was published in 1635 called The Four Ages of Man. And this is the figure, as you can see, representing youth. So it's a 1630, it's quite late in the period, which is why he looks like a Civil War soldier.
He looks a lot like what I think of a musketeer with those high socks and everything. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's quite a lot of artistic license there because he's definitely presented in a more military fashion. But there's a little verse, which you could probably just about see at the bottom underneath his feet. It says, "Next place of office which I do attain is swashing Whiffler with my staff and chain, in which hot office, when I long have been, I swaggering leave, and to be stayed begin."
Oh,
so
yes.
Is the stage between childhood and adulthood. So he's a young man, and he's very full of himself. He's swashing around town.
Yes, with his head pointed over his shoulder there and his hand on his hip. He looks very swaggering, absolutely.
Yeah, so again, this is a kind of literary representation of the Whiffler, which is not necessarily what people would have seen it in reality, which is why I was saying right from the start, there's a kind of metaphorical sort of literary use of the word Whiffler, which is not necessarily the same thing as the real Whifflers. One thing they definitely did have was these wooden staves.
I don't mean to interrupt, but just to clarify, by a wooden stave, you mean that long staff that he's got there? Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, stave staff, same word.
Okay.
It's just they said staves usually in this period. And they were normally painted white and quite often decorated with ribbons. So they kind of made them look a bit festive. And so they stood out a little, obviously, on the streets.
So very identifiable. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also they have a function. You know, if you're having to kind of push people aside occasionally, if they're kind of getting a bit too close to the procession, then having a sort of stout wooden stick in your hand is probably going to be quite helpful for that.
I would think so. Yeah, it would be a deterrent at least.
I haven't seen any, funnily enough, although I did look on some printed sources earlier today, lots of references to chains, and the quotation I just gave you mentioned a chain, staff and chain. But I have seen absolutely no evidence in the city documents that chains were bought or worn. So unless it's just something that happened and no one ever thought to mention it, I don't really know. But the staff definitely, the ribbons definitely.
So when Whifflers were present at some of these functions, they were actually serving a practical function in the event as providing security. They weren't just for show, even though their staves had ribbons. They were visually pageant oriented in that way, but they were actually there to provide this kind of security as opposed to just be for show. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they were, you got to remember in this period, the city is extremely small. A lot of the streets are very narrow. There are no pavements before the 18th century in London. So you need a physical barrier. The livery companies tended to stand in sort of wooden frames anyway, but you did need to make sure that the crush of people didn't get in the way. There's a wonderful entry from the Pewterers Company records, actually, I'll read out for you. In 1571, January 1571, the Queen visited the Royal Exchange, on Gresham's Royal Exchange, part of its formal opening. And there was a great deal of pageantry associated with that because it was a big event for the city.
Yeah.
And the Pewterers Company employed whifflers, as they all did. And they say, item paid for 4 small staves, serving for those which were appointed as whifflers, to guard the company from the thrust and violence of people. Now, it's really unusual to see a reference to the possible sort of dangers, the sort of risks and the some sort of unpleasantness, perhaps, of pageantry. Usually it's always very decorous. So the whifflers are clearly there to kind of guard and protect the procession as it goes through the streets.
Tracey's article on whifflers for the Reed Project Civic London says, quote, veteran antiquarian John Stowe performed a whiffler's role on behalf of his livery company, the Merchant Tailors, in the 1560s. And the article continues to indicate that serving in this role was more like receiving a court summons than an actual career path. Tracey, we talked about the young boy in the image going from a boy to a man in this role as whiffler, but what did it look like for someone to become a whiffler?
It was a kind of, I think as far as London citizens were concerned, a necessary evil, really. It's not something that I get any sense anyone embarked on with any great enthusiasm. They were nominated and chosen by their livery companies. So you have I'll talk you through a kind of scenario very quickly. These things usually involved a trip to the pub. So a group of the people who ran the livery company, such as the Pewterers I just mentioned, would go to a tavern and discuss amongst themselves which of their members would be best equipped to serve as a whiffler for, say, Lord Mayor's Day in October. They may have actually, going back to one of your earlier questions, they may have thought about, who would be the most kind of physically vigorous amongst their members. And you do find instances of people being excused because they were too old or too infirm. And then the company court just basically formally chose these individuals whose names often appear in the records, actually, which is kind of a nice bit of detail to get a sense of who they were. And so basically, it's your job this year. It's Buggin's turn. It's your job to perform this role. Anything between 4 and 12 members of the companies, each company, were asked to do it, and there were quite severe penalties if you refused to serve and you had no good excuse.
So it is almost like, I don't know if this is the way it works in the UK, but here in the US, whenever there is a jury to be put together, you get like a letter in the mail that it's your turn as a citizen to serve on the jury, and you do have to go or you can be put in jail. So that sounds like the whiffler for the 16th century was sort of the same thing. There was a civic duty to be performed, and the citizens got chosen. Okay. That's
a really, really good analogy, actually, because I haven't seen anybody being put in jail, but they were put in jail for being naughty in other respects, but certainly quite substantial fines. There we are. A man called Henry Bartlett refused to serve for the Weavers' Company in 1614, and he paid a fine of 10 shillings, and he was also fined another fine for disobedience to the company. A man called Avery Wood paid 40 shillings to be spared the work of his company.
He really didn't want to do it.
He was a bit flush, and he thought, well, if I give them a big amount of money, maybe they'll just let me off. I would imagine, because it's like being the person who clears up after the party. You want to be part of the party. You don't want to be one of the people who's doing the work behind the scenes. That's right. Probably why they're reluctant to do it.
Now, when the OED defines a whiffler, they specifically include several weapons that are associated with whifflering, to make up a word there, but they use a battle axe and a javelin specifically. These are not dainty weapons, and notably are not the weapons of a 16th century gentleman that we think of, like a rapier or a dagger might have been considered. Whifflers seem pretty closely associated with armor, but at least one set of scholars indicate that using whiffler in a military sense is actually an antiquated definition by the time Shakespeare uses it in a military context for Henry V. In their commentary on Shakespeare's plays, Samuel Johnson and company write about the whiffler by saying, quote, in a diary of King Henry's siege of Bologna in 15 1544, mention is made of the drums and Whifflers marching at the head of the king's army. From this old French word Whiffleur came the English word Whiffler, which anciently was used in its proper literal sense, end quote. They give the example of King Philip hosting a joust in 1554, and the challengers entered the list, I'm quoting them now, preceded by their Whifflers, their footmen, and their armorers, end quote. These references seem to indicate a Whiffler was a standard part of a military or fighting operation, almost like the holder of weapons or someone who announced the fighter had arrived for the fray. Tracey, was this still the definition and function of a Whiffler by the time Shakespeare was writing that reference to Whifflers in Henry V, or had Whiffler come to mean something totally separate from a military context by now?
I would say it was more a matter of evolution, really. You do find members of the companies being required to act as soldiers for musters, particularly early in the years of Elizabeth's reign, when clearly, she was a bit concerned about threats to her stability. So, and they're being equipped with muskets and gunpowder and that kind of thing, and military sort of uniforms. And there's not that much difference between that and what a Whiffler did. It's kind of more a question of scale than being something completely different. And as that thrust and violence of the crowd quotation suggests, it could perhaps sometimes get quite feisty. They might actually be called upon to fight off people who were trying to get in the way. And there was a lot of drink taken on those days, so it might have got a bit out of control on occasion, I'd imagine. But yeah, in the main, they were these more sort of civic, ceremonial functions, really.
Well, I want to ask about some of the contemporaries of William Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, who were involved in civic pageantry. What's their overlap with Whifflers in this sense?
There's one direct overlap, actually, which is Anthony Munday, who was a playwright and pamphleteer and poet, pretty much the exact contemporary of Shakespeare's, though he lived a bit longer. And he was a member of the Drapers' Company, and he produced a number of the Lord Mayor's shows from the late 1590s through to the mid-1620s. And he was, on one occasion at least, asked to serve as a Whiffler for his company, the Drapers' Company, for Lord Mayor's Day. So the other instance that you've already mentioned in terms of a writer is John Stowe, who was employed as a Whiffler by his company, the Merchant Taylors, in 1560s, quite a long time previous to that. But a lot of dramatists were involved in civic pageantry in other forms. Ben Jonson wrote some speeches for King James's royal entry in 1604, for example, and he definitely put in a commission bid to be involved in the Lord Mayor's show, I think the same year, actually. Thomas Middleton is one of the biggest figures in civic pageantry and, of course, in the stage. Middleton produced a number of Lord Mayor's shows and was also employed as a formal role, the city chronologer, the man who was kind of charged with putting up entertainments for the city from 1620 to when he died, 7 years later, rather. And the others, Thomas Hayward was involved in civic pageantry, Decker was involved in civic pageantry, but John Webster did one too. So, there's a very, very strong overlap. And you also find very well-known actors performing in civic pageantry as well, men like Aline, who you think of in relation to the Rose Playhouse down on Bankside, rather than parading around the streets of London pretending to be a Greek god. But it's the same. It's all drama. It just happens to be
performance. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely, it's all performance. There was a lot of music. There was a lot of kind of fanciful side shows. There were tumblers. There were rope artists. There was all sorts of things going on. It was quite a day.
This is fascinating. I know we would love to dive into civic pageantry and the role of Whifflers even more. What are some of your favorite resources or books that you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, I just have to mention my books.
Absolutely.
I've written one book about the Lord Mayor's show in the early modern period, and I've also written a book about Anthony Munday and his work for the city. But in terms of freely available resources, I think the two I would point people towards is the blog site that is connected to the research project I'm doing at the moment, which is civiclondon.wordpress.com, which is our records of early English drama work on finding just these kinds of details from the civic record. So if you want more of these little kind of anecdotes and vignettes, that's the place to look. Another place that is really good is the Map of Early Modern London website, which shows you the routes of these kind of ceremonial processions. It gives you access to original texts in edited format. And there's a series of very interesting kind of contextual essays there as well about sounds and music and that kind of thing. So probably those two as a starting point would be a good way in for someone who's not really an expert.
These are both excellent websites. I spent hours in there. You could get lost and read so much interesting things. We'll link to these as well as Tracey's books in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you check there for even more history. Tracey, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
I don't really want to take those two, which I have to.
Well, we send them with everyone. What you do with them is your choice, I guess.
I've thought long and hard about it. I think in terms of a work of literature from the early modern period, from my specialism period, that I would not get bored of very quickly, it'd probably have to be Paradise Lost, actually.
Oh, that's a good choice. Yes,
which
I like
is just
that.
one of the most wonderful things ever written, and never ceases to astonish me every time I reread it. So, yeah, something from the 17th century, Paradise Lost.
Well, you'd be well set up on your deserted island with that choice for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, when I get back to London, when obviously we're kind of quasi-lockdown here still, I'll get back to the archives and I'll carry on ferreting out little details about Whifflers and drummers and playwrights and all those kinds of things. That's really what I'm all about. And we're also going to be working with another group of people on doing a sort of digital map of entertainment spaces in early modern London, which is very
fantastic.
exciting. Yeah, really excited about that. So,
I can't wait to see that. Well, thank you so much, Tracey, for being here and talking us through the history of Whifflers. This has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Find links to the resources we mentioned in today's episode, along with Tracey's book and resources about Civic London, in the show notes for today's episode. Find all of that, archival images, as well as download my hand-illustrated map of theaters in 1600s London at castycash.com/episode 127. That's castycash.com/EP127. To see the video version of this episode, where you can follow along visually with the picture of the Whiffler Tracey shares during this episode, you can subscribe to That Shakespeare Life's digital streaming app. For just $5 a month, you can have access to the video version of our podcast, along with bonus episodes, archaeological footage, animated plays, documentaries, and more, all about the life of William Shakespeare and completely commercial-free. Find that and subscribe today at castycash.com/experience. That's castycash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.